Hi everyone, I've read through the 8 logic models that I've received so far, as well as all of your discussion posts and feedback to each other. And I just thought it would be helpful for all of you to talk a little bit about the differences between a logic model and a theory of change model, and give you all the option of perhaps for your final project in here, using a theory of change model rather than a logic model, because they can sometimes be more helpful to share with stakeholders and things like that. Those of you who are interested in seeking grant funding, the logic model is probably still going to be required, and that is, as a lot of you have said in your discussions, that you've, done these in a lot of classes before. So I just want to make sure that, in this semester, we really sort out what the differences are between the logic model and the theory of change model, what the goal is of each one, and then I do want to give you a little bit of space to play, with whichever type of model might suit you best for your goals and your interactions with your stakeholders. So a logic model is very simple, right? It is something that, a grant funder can take a look at super quickly. You can almost think of it as a resume versus a CV when we compare these two things. Your resume is one page. People are going to take a look at SEP for 7 seconds and kind of say, this is what's going on in this project. So it should be very simplistic, and very straightforward in terms of easy to read. And, as you've seen, we have inputs, activities, outputs, intermediate outcomes, long-term outcomes, and we might have short-term outcomes in there as well, depending on the type of logic model we're using. On the other hand, a theory of change model really dives deeper and explains why. All right, so a lot of you are having a little bit of trouble figuring out where IRB approval might go and where, results of a survey might go. Theory of change can be really helpful for mapping this out a little bit more. So you have your long-term outcome, which might be your vision or your mission, depending on how you wrote the VMOs. And then you kind of show the activities that happen, on the way to the long-term outcome. And on the bottom here, this is all the stuff you're doing now, right? So this is everything that you need to do on the way to that outcome. So that might be, your IRB approval, and then it's the results of the survey, and then the results of the survey are going to influence how you complete an intervention, and then you'll assess the results of that intervention and then maybe perform another intervention, and then eventually you'll get to that long-term outcome. So this is much more complicated, but as I read all of your feedback and advice to each other, I can really see that the logic model does seem a little useless, and I want to talk about why that might be, and why this might be a better format for you all to use in your final papers if desired. So in terms of being different, logic models are going to graphically illustrate program components, creating one will help the stakeholder clearly identify outcomes, inputs, and activities. And that stakeholder is typically the grant funder. When we're looking at our actual stakeholders that some of you are working with now in terms of those invested in your final outcome, the theories of change might actually be more helpful for those stakeholders. So the ones that care about, this long-term outcome, right? So, for example, in Kenna's project, that's going to be all of the organizations that we're looking at that care about, doula access. So when we look at theories of change, it will link the outcomes and activities to explain how and why the desired change is expected to come about. So another way they're different, logic models will start with the program and illustrate its components. And theories of change might start with a program, but they're best when starting with a goal before deciding what programmatic approaches are needed. So this is, I think, where people are a little bit confused with the logic model, because all of you already started with a goal with the Vimosa project last week, and now you have that goal, and so a lot of you are almost creating theories of change models versus logic models because it doesn't feel like the logic model is robust enough. And a lot of the comments you're giving to each other on discussion are really towards more of the theories of change model and explaining why, right? And so that's why I think this might be a better way for people to go on their final project. And somebody like Jeffrey who hates logic models, right? You might be able to use this model in a little bit more robust way to explain your program in a way that feels more real, right? And then how they're different as well. Logic models require the identifying program components. So then you can see if the outcomes are out of sync with the inputs and activities, but they don't show why, right? So they're not showing, what the results of the survey are that then will influence, how your, intervention is carried out. And then theories of change require justifications at each step. So you have to articulate why something is going to cause something else. So it's more of a causal model. And so in this model, you would say, IRB approval is needed. And once IRB approval is obtained, then the survey will be distributed. And it's expected that X number of people will respond to the survey in this way, and then that will cause the components of the intervention to be carried out. That intervention will be successful because you used the survey to influence the components of the intervention, which then will lead to the desired outcome of, decreased childhood obesity, decreased sodium intake at, Tufts Medical Center, increased activity among certain populations, right? So as you're looking at this is showing, how each step is going to influence the next step, which feels more real in terms of, how well each of you know each other's projects at this point. You're giving recommendations that are just naturally going towards this theories of change model rather than the logic model, because you know the ins and outs of each other's, intentions, your projects, your visions, your missions. And so this is where a lot of those comments are coming. But in the logic model, you can really keep it a little bit more simple. So when you look at the difference, the logic model might feel like it's not telling the whole picture, because you need to know how well a precondition needs to be met in order to get to the next goal. So for example, how often do students need to attend their after-school program in order for their reading score tests to improve? And so that means that, as you're looking at the cause and effect, you need to create some predictions around that. And so in the theories of change model, especially, and I made this comment on a lot of your objectives assignments as well, you need some research to support or to back, how this change is going to be affected. So for example, in this example, right? You might find some studies or some review articles to show how often students attended their after-school program in order for reading test scores to improve, right? So when we're looking at some of your objectives, that X number of people will respond to the survey and that will be enough to influence your intervention, some of you do need to just bring in some data to show that is a powerful number that can then move forward, or show how are you gonna tell whether that's enough respondents to, influence your next goal. So that's a place where the theories of change model can be a little bit tougher and a little bit more confusing, but it can be helpful in some ways too, to kind of create a model where you know what type of information and what type of research you need in order to validate, how your results will then influence the next piece of your intervention. So a logic model would just tell you that the after-school program is an activity and the improved reading scores is an outcome, right? And it might tell you that attendance at the after-school program is an intermediate outcome, but that's all it's doing. The logic model is very, nuts and bolts, straightforward, right, as you go through. On the other hand, a theories of change model would say, students need to attend the after-school program 3 days a week for a minimum of 60 days, and the curriculum needs to focus on the love of reading and literacy in order for test scores to rise, right? So this, as I said before, is a much more robust organization of, how and why you need these things, right? Which requires some data to support that. Why do students need to attend this? Have other studies shown this, for example? And so this is where a lot of your advice to each other was going when I looked at your discussion. And so, you can think about, you can use this if you want, but that turns it into a theory of change model rather than just a logic model, if that makes sense. So, in summary, the logic model is a representation, it's a list of components, and it's just descriptive, right? Versus theory of change, rather than just being a representation, it requires deeper levels of critical thinking. Rather than a list, it creates a pathway of change. And rather than just being descriptive, it's explanatory. So logic models are really great when you just want to show someone something they can understand at a glance. So, as my example before, I said a resume versus a CV, right? The resume is the logic model. The CV is the theory of change model. It can demonstrate you've identified basic inputs, outputs, outcomes, and summarizes complex stuff into a basic categories. And so this is where, all of you just know a little too much about each other and a little too much about each other's projects to give advice on simplifying things. And so each of your advisory, goals in the discussion were just leading more to a theory of change model naturally versus a logic model. And so theories of change are best used when you design a complex initiative and want to have a plan for success, want to evaluate appropriate outcomes at the right time in the right sequence, and explain why an initiative worked or didn't work and what went wrong. So, as we look at, the example on achalasia, for example, this is a little bit more of a theory of change model when we're looking at, activities, short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes. And, you could make this a little bit more complex in order to show a flow, to make it a true theory of change model, to show how each thing is happening and the activities that are going to result in that. So I'm just going to show really quickly, this is an example of where I could see the achalasia logic model turning into something that looked more like a theory of change model. So this is just a sample that I found of, a theory of change model online, looking at the Oregon Paint Stewardship pilot program, and their funders and evaluators allowed them to create a theory of change model versus a logic model. So as you can see, it's much more complicated and there's a flow and it's showing what needs to happen in order for, paint to be used more appropriately overall in Oregon. So just an example there. I also wanted to bring in an example of more of a theory of change model that that Kenna brought to my attention in the looking at the framework for obesity prevention efforts targeting early care and education setting. And so I've posted this PowerPoint, in this email as well to allow you all to take a look at this and maybe use some components of this as well in terms of, this is more of a list format rather than this wild, messy theory of change model in this way, and could be carried out a little bit more easily with probably the skills that you all have in terms of design and things. But some of you might be graphic artists, or you might want to just draw something by hand and, and show a theory of change model here for the purposes of this class. So I hope this was helpful, everyone, to kind of talk through the differences between the logic model and the theory of change model, and just give each of you, some opportunities to use each one as you'd like in order to further your projects. So good luck, everyone, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and we can set up a time to chat on the phone. I'll be giving you some feedback on your logic models, and in that feedback, that I give throughout the week. This week, I will be kind of talking through, which components look a little bit more like a theory of change model and give some suggestions on how you might want to move forward with that. So have a fantastic weekend, everyone, and I look forward to reading through all your logic models and maybe eventually your theory of change models. Have a great day.